Reddit has a lot of scary stories, and a lot of them are in the winter in the snow, and I want to read some of those to you guys. I'm trying to hit 100K by the end of the year, so please subscribe, follow my Instagram, join my Discord so we can hang out. I'm actually taking submissions for stories now on my Discord if you want to submit a story, and maybe I might read it. And let's just get right into this. I saw something impossible in northern Canada. The northern Yukon can be a god-forsaken, desolate place entirely unfit for human presence. The land aggressively fights off any intruders, whether by water, wind, or spiteful, creeping cold. Even the native Gwich'in peoples would migrate southward when the air got too angry. I loved that stuff. Unlike people, the great outdoors has the decency to not hide the fact that deep down is an asshole. It's why people rarely visited, and in driving everyone away until I was entirely alone, I was able to shake off the rotten crust that forms around the edges of our lives, the byproduct of unfulfilled dreams and apathy. I didn't need to go to a church. Churches concentrated the problems. They didn't purify them. This trip, though, has proven more soul-cleansing than even I had signed up for. See, we become arrogant enough to believe that the world revolves around humans and just assume that there's a big white nothing where we decide not to step foot. Remember that every random occurrence in your life is the bigger world laughing at the notion that we are anywhere near the center of it. The trip was a birthday present to myself. We all know what we want to be surprised with, so I gave everyone I knew the privilege of taking care of it myself. The resort, if you could call it that, is just 4 cabins on the tip of a peninsula. It had the record of 1,913 straight days where the low temperature was never more than 10 degrees above freezing. I took a plane to a bus to another plane to a car to a snowmobile to an outboard motor dinghy just to get to the spot where I had to begin walking to get there. 50 years, half a century. But when you're walking entirely alone through the snow, not even the birds challenge nature's whiteout with either plumage or pitch. That's when time becomes real. We get so damn impatient waiting for the next demand, delivery, or day off that we forget that time doesn't get renewed. Counting down the days to whatever seems so important is nothing more than quite literally dying a little. A few hours ago, my face was shoved so deeply into this fact that I can still taste it on my beard. Jack, the owner, was the only other person at the resort. It was perfect. I nodded at him as I passed by his cabin on my way to one of the nearby lakes. The weather was perfect for ice fishing, and this particular lake was small enough to have frosted from tip to tip. It was the ideal serving platter, really. When the hole was cut, the line dropped and my seat set. I eased myself down and took in the silence. The ground and sky can be white at the same time, appalling both the sense of time and space. The wind whipped around just slightly enough to stir up thoughts, give them life, and have them chase each other about while I watched. With the passage of enough time, thought and sense become one. I'm sure that's where the First Nations people came up with the Wahila. It's a pure white beast that can move seamlessly in and out of both the snow and the mind. My thoughts seemed to take shape out there on the ice, and time started to make me sick. I decided that I needed to leave. I had hoped that my ill feelings would subside by the time that I had packed everything. They didn't. You know that feeling that you're being watched? There's at least comfort in the idea that you're not alone and you know what's watching you. Do you have any idea what it's like to feel watched and to be utterly alone at the same time? I started to jog. With the near whiteout conditions, I was using my sense of hearing to balance almost as much as my vision. When the wind growls, whipped from my right ear to my left, I almost lost my balance. The same sound then shot from behind me to in front of me with no corresponding visual, and left me only with a sensation of speed, just the wind. But the wind is an ocean, not an object. I was unable to move any faster. I strained to hear the sound again amongst the buzzing wind, and I realized that it was the wind, or more accurately, the wind was the sound. We can feel wind. It can ruffle my beard. There was no wind today, but there was a distant buzzing sound that had been registering in my subconscious for longer than I could remember. Now I realized that it was the distant noise of whatever had just brushed by. It got nearer. Buzz, slash, whoosh. I nearly fell over. I was moving very slowly through the snow. Then one touched me. It was a graze, but it was aggressive enough to make me stumble. I nearly fell. Then I was knocked back into the other direction, which balanced me out. I dropped the fishing equipment and ran. I could see shapes swirling all around me. White fur on white snow on white sky fitted in and out of my vision at a speed that made a mockery of my attempted sprint. The cold air burned my lungs. I ran faster. I was in full survival mode, which meant not thinking too much. The little mental energy that I did have at my disposal was focused on one question. What the hell are these things? I wanted an answer. I needed an answer. Then I got an answer, or at least part of one, and I wished I hadn't. It flashed in the corner of my eye, just briefly enough so that it was more speculation than memory. The thing was bigger and wider than a polar bear. It ran as a fluid, bending to all manner of curvature and speed. I think I saw its face. I don't believe what I saw was just imagination. I saw a snout. I saw tusks. I know I saw the eyes because they made the least sense of anything. There were no pupils or irises. They were only red, and I swear that they were illuminating their own light, and I know that at least one of them was smiling. They increased the frequency of their collisions with me as I pulled away from the lake and ran desperately towards safety. The knocks came from all directions, so they weren't forcing me to take any path. I saw the cabin. I thanked whatever deity was listening. The thought began to brew in my mind that there might not be safety in the cabin though, that there might not be safety anywhere. I wasn't thankful for the deity after that. I could feel the tears freeze on my nose. I ran faster. The hits were getting aggressive now and extremely painful. When one almost shattered my knee from the side, I collapsed. Get up, get up, get up. I got up and ran again. If my leg had sustained major damage, I couldn't feel it at the moment. The red eyes flew across the white horizon. They left trails in the air as they slid past. The red eyes flew across the white horizon. They left trails in the air as they slid past. That's when I really thought about dying for the first time. Would it be better to focus on a quick end instead of a fruitless hope for survival? Isn't the purpose of living a good life nothing more than to end up in a good death? One hit me on the head so hard that I saw stars and then snow. It took me several seconds to orient myself well enough to stand. During that time, the attacks ceased. I finally got to my feet, found the cabin again, and shakily started to run. I was close, very close. The hits commenced with a vengeance. They get into this anytime they want. The knowledge struck deep and held fast. They're playing with me. I'll be honest, I slowed down my run. Nothing destroys inspiration faster than realizing how much the bigger world is in control and how little say we have in it. I think they sensed my slow pace, and that's why they started slashing. I could hear the harsh sting of a cruel gash across my face, the cutting cold coupling with the sinister slice. They ripped open my jacket, making a mockery of my attempts to shield myself from the outside. Cuts opened on my thighs, and I started to stumble. I pinwheeled my arms comically in an attempt to regain my balance, and that's when one caught my hand. Now there was heat as fiery agony rocketed through my body. My entire arm felt like it was aflame, and all I could think of was how to end the pain. I staggered. Looking around wildly, I realized where I was. Jack's cabin door was just steps away. I forced myself to think of survival, to hold my hand aloft as I pushed forth the final sprint. I could see blood on the snow and knew it was mine. How badly does a person have to bleed before their own blood lands in front of them while running? The vision of Jack's door bounced in front of my outstretched left hand. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, slam. My head smashed into the wooden door frame as my body was tossed like a rag doll. If the cabin had not stopped me, I'm sure I would have flown the length of a house. I lay in a heap on the ground, unable to move. When I finally fluttered my eyelids open, I could see that my right hand had come to rest just inches from my face. A wave of nausea washed over and through me when I saw it. My smallest finger was gone. The edges of the cut were serrated and torn. My hand was completely coated in crimson. I wiggled my fingers to see if my hand was still alive. They danced feebly in response. I turned to look into the face of my tormentors. I wondered how quick it would be. They were gone. The silence had returned. Only my thoughts flitted back and forth in the still air. I got groggily to my feet, turned the knob, and stumbled into the room. Jack looked at me in surprise. He had clearly heard nothing of what transpired outside. I stumbled to a desk and threw my body against it, hoping that it would support my exhausted frame. "We get out of here. We need to now, and a doctor, they're out there." I gave up trying to be coherent and showed Jack my mutilated hand. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. "They chased me," I finally articulated, as thought it would clarify things. Jack opened his eyes. When he spoke, it was with a defeated sort of calm. "How far did they get this time?" I stared at him in response. "How long were you chased?" he asked in a revision of his question. I felt as though a lead weight had been dropped into my gut. "Right up to the door," I said with sudden calm and control. He nodded quickly with his head down. "It will take some time before we can get you to a doctor. Let's get you cleaned up the best we can." He did not meet my gaze. That's what brings me to this point. Living on the edge of what we see as reality requires survival skills, but Jack seemed too prepared to stitch me up. Neither of us discussed the possibility of searching for my lost finger. I'm typing this now, relying on the cabin's spotty internet connection to rekindle at least one thread of human connection. That will have to do until tomorrow morning, which will be the first chance we get to leave this forgotten place. I could make a big deal about what happened. I could choose not to spread the rehearsed story of a chainsaw accident, but no one would believe me, so there's no point. Beyond that, though, two much more important truths loom large. The first is that I am quite certain that they will not be found if they do not want to, so all searching would be moot. The second is that they will find us when they decide they want to. And despite the control we like to believe we have, there's not a damn thing that any of us can do about it. A real Wisconsin winter. Jeff was a good roommate in college. He was quiet, friendly when necessary, and always down for a movie. I guess I would call him my friend, although we didn't hang out much outside the dorm. He was much more intellectual than me, and I was much more into sports than him. We were kind of the odd couple, but it worked. Every summer we would go back to our respective homes, me in California, him in Wisconsin, and then in August we'd meet back up for another year. To be honest, I never wondered what Jeff's home would look like. I guess we weren't close enough for me to think of him like that. But senior year, he started mentioning where he was from. He offered little tidbits about Wisconsin and the tiny town he was born in. It didn't bother me. I figured he wanted to get closer. Then he started to joke that I should come stay at his place over winter break and experience a real Wisconsin winter. I told him it gets cold in California sometimes, and he laughed. The kind of laugh someone wise would give to someone stupid. He just smiled his dopey smile at me and said there is nothing like a Wisconsin winter. You have to be there to really understand it. He twirled his pen between his fingers. I followed the pen as it bounced between his thumb and forefinger, swirling up and down. I thought of my older brother who had said something nearly identical to me. I was 7 years younger than him. When I turned 10, he decided to start bragging about his sex life. He described the acts in close detail. I thought about my brother and what he would say to Jeff. "Alright," I told him, "prove it. Take me home with you at break and I'll see it for myself." A grin spread across his face. "I have to warn you, Ian, it gets very cold. A cold you can feel in your bones. Your face will be on fire with it. There's nowhere to hide from the cold. It finds you even under the heaviest blockade." Dude, you sound like an idiot. We both laughed. Jeff had a tendency to wax poetic. He was an English major after all. "Okay, fine, but it's chilly. You'll have to buy a better coat, maybe snow boots. We aren't going to the North Pole, are we?" "No, but we might as well be." He placed the pen down and tossed the hair out of his face. "It's like the opposite of hell, except you're still there. Just the fire is replaced with ice." "Good thing I have some extra blubber," I said as I patted my stomach. He rolled his eyes and turned back to his computer. I swung up to my bunk and stared at the ceiling. Being cold as hell wasn't the worst way to spend a winter break, or so I thought. 10 hours into our road trip and I was ready to be in an actual building. We were driving Jeff's Honda, and although it was immaculate, comfort was not its strong suit. Jeff insisted we keep all of the snacks organized and contained so we wouldn't ruin his interior. I told him that he was the only 21-year-old with a car cleaner than his mother's. "You obviously don't know my mother," he laughed. "So how far away are we?" I knew I sounded like a whiny kid, but Jeff just kept smiling. "Another 5 to go." "And you drive home every break?" I longed for the comfort of my first-class airplane seat. Yep, every break, I just can't stay away. And what's the town called again? He sighed. Plainfield. Sounds pretty boring. I leaned back, happy with my joke. It's a tiny place, but it has its charms. If you like cows or soybeans, you'll love it. Can't say I'm too fond of either. I opened the package marked chips and shoved some in my mouth. Jeff grimaced but stayed silent. When we finally pulled up to a house, it was getting dark. We'd been driving since 7 that morning, and I wanted more than anything to curl up in a bed and sleep. Snow whipped up from the ground in spiraling ringlets of white. Despite the temperature, Wisconsin was surprisingly beautiful. The hills had lovely leafless trees, and the empty pastures stretched like checkerboards across the fields. I appreciated the view, but the -3-degree temperature was certainly biting. Jeff's house was at least a 10-minute drive from any other structure we saw. It was literally in the middle of nowhere, but at least it was a house. All of the lights were out. Jeff stopped the car and let out a long breath. He turned to me. I'm going to unlock the door and get the fire lit. Can you stay in the car for a few minutes? Sure, just hurry. It's creepy out here. He nodded and rushed inside. A light turned on and I could see him bustling around. I rubbed my arms to stay warm. It suddenly felt darker. I was more keenly aware of how isolated we were. I saw a large light flickering in the far window. I was anxious to get out of the car. The door opened and I saw Jeff beckon to me. I gracefully ran into the house, leaving my bags behind. I rushed the fireplace. It sat on the back wall. 2 shabby couches were positioned close by, and I sat, reaching my fingers towards the flame. Jeff sat across from me, his arms folded. I felt a bit warmer, so I looked around. The house itself was very small, but homey. Decorative needlepoints and old-timey paintings littered the walls. Crocheted blankets covered almost every surface. It looked like a place transported from a different era. The walls were paneled wood, and the floors were decked in a red shag carpet. It smelled of smoke and decay. Is this like your grandma's place? I looked up to see Jeff staring at me. No, this is where I grew up. His voice was as cold as the wind outside. Sorry, man, I didn't mean to offend you. He didn't blink. So you don't have heat, just a fireplace? A fireplace is heat, Ian. Is that not enough for you? I watched the fire reflected in his eyes and thought to myself, how much did I really know this guy? I let him drive me 15 hours away from school and put me up in this old house. I shook my head. Of course I knew him. I'd known him almost 4 years. Why did he look like a stranger? Plainfield has a pretty famous resident, you know, he said softly. Or did, rather. He's dead now. Oh yeah? I inched closer to the fire. We were in all the newspapers. This was before I was born, but we never really outlived the hype. People come here all the time to try and imagine what life was like for Ed. Still get a reporter now and then too. Ed? Jeff smiled. You really need to take a history class, Ian. Or actually a psych class. Talked all about old Ed and abnormal psych. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Why are you telling me this? To give you an idea of what life is like here. He stood up. I think it's time to show you my bedroom. God, yeah, a bed would be amazing. I tried to shrug off the weird vibes I was getting. It was probably just the cold getting to my head. Jeff took off and I followed. We entered an ancient looking kitchen that hadn't been touched in years. A wood burning stove towered above the homemade table and rickety chairs. A doily sat in the center of a table with 2 letters in the lace, J and D. A small pantry held nothing but canned meats and other sundries. Jeff stopped in front of a door and fumbled with a large padlock. He pulled a key from his pocket and the scrape of the lock turning was intense. He swung it open and motioned inside. I peeked from behind him and realized the door led to a basement. Your bedroom is in the basement? Very astute, Ian. He began descending the stairs. Come on, you can rest down here. I hesitated. Jeff, where's your family? He paused halfway down the stairs. They're visiting my uncle in Milwaukee. He swallowed audibly. Come on down, Ian. Unless you're scared. That last comment reminded me of my older brother, who once left me in the woods to find my own way out. I begged him not to leave me, and he just laughed. What are you, scared? I wanted to say yes, I'm terrified, but I knew if I admitted my true feelings, he would never respect me. So I let him leave me there, alone and 9 years old. It took me all day to find the road and another 2 hours to walk home. My mother screamed at me, and I was grounded for a month. But my big brother nodded as if I had done something heroic. Had I told that story to Jeff? I stepped forward towards the stairs, and Jeff turned away to continue down. It was dark below, but I managed managed to reach the floor without falling. Jeff was a little ways away from me, and suddenly a light bulb was turned on. I covered my eyes for a second and then adjusted to the light. The basement was even smaller than the kitchen. It had a few shelves of canned food, some random storage containers, and an old dog crate. The ground looked earthen. I smelled piss and vomit. Something must have died down here. I looked at Jeff, who was shaking. His eyes were big and he was scared. Cold. Hey man, are you okay? This isn't your bedroom. I walked toward him to put a hand on his shoulder, but he backed up. With an unsteady hand, he pointed at the dog crate. My bedroom, he said in a whisper. I followed his gaze and stared at the crate. It was made of metal bars with claw marks surrounding it. It couldn't be more than 2 feet high. My mouth hung open. You slept in that? Every day, and most of the day too. His voice was pitchy. I've never told anyone before. My fear faded away and I felt only sadness for Jeff. That's messed up. Why did your parents do that to you? Because of this. He slid his hands over one of the storage containers. The lid popped off and a smell filled the basement. I gagged. Jeff lifted a lamp from the container. Why would... But my words stopped when I realized what the lampshade was made of. It's skin, Ian, from my grandma. She died and I borrowed her for my projects. His face turned from nervous to excited. Its own town's legacy. I knew I had to keep the spirit alive. I backed up, ready to bolt up the stairs. He grinned. Where do you think you're going? I have the car keys and it's a 6-mile walk to the next house. Think you can make it now that the sun's down? It's probably 13 below by now. What the hell did you bring me here for? He pulled the lamp bag and pulled out a second item. It was a skull. My uncle died from brain cancer, so I turned his head into a bowl. Isn't it beautiful? I'm going to call the cops, Jeff. I reached into my pocket but realized I'd left my phone charging in the car. But I haven't even shown you my best work. He reached back down and lifted a framed painting, but it wasn't a painting. Holy hell, is that? Yes. Ed Gein had one on his wall, so I wanted my own. Unfortunately, no one had died recently, so I had to take it from my sister. She didn't survive the encounter. He stared at it lovingly. This is the one that got me locked in the crate. My mother didn't like my projects. She wanted everything to be pristine, easy, organized. He laughed softly. I didn't fit into the box she wanted me to, so she locked me down here. Made me sleep in my own shit. My father would sneak me scraps of food, but once I went a whole year without speaking to anyone. Can you imagine that, Ian? A year in a tiny cage eating chicken bones and cockroaches, no one to even scream at? He stroked the frame, but my father felt sorry for me. He read about psychology and thought I needed help. And I did, I'll admit that. Jeff, please, I just want to stay safe. I tried to become as big and strong as I could, but Jeff was unfazed. He let me out. He told me he would take me away from here, somewhere where I could find my sanity. He sighed, but I didn't want to leave, at least not without some trophies. He put the frame down and motioned to a box near me. Open it, Ian. No, I wanted to cry. Do it or I'll kill you. He cocked his head. This was not the same man who watched Die Hard with me in our dorm room. This was someone different, someone demonic. I'm stronger than you, I shot back. You can't hurt me. He looked at me with disappointment. Slowly, he pulled a revolver from his jacket. I've had it the whole time. I could have killed you so many times. I won't lie, I've thought about it. But you were the first person to treat me like a human since my father. You talked to me, laughed with me. I thought I could trust you. He locked eyes with me. Now open the box. Shivering, I bent down and lifted the lid of the box. Tears started flowing down my cheeks despite my stubbornness. Now lift it up. His tone was joyful. Sniffling, I reached into the box and lifted the one thing inside. It was a large slab of skin, dried and sewn together. When I held it up, I could see it was shaped like some sort of dress. I didn't want to touch it, but I didn't know how to escape. That's me, Ian. It's a self-portrait. Can you see the beauty of it? It's my mother and father mixed together, just like me. He walked toward me, and it took everything in my power to not collapse. This is why I brought you here. I want you to know me. I do know you, Jeff. Let's just get out of here and go get something to eat. I calmed my voice and took deep breaths. No, he screamed, making me almost drop the horror I was holding. You will put this on and know me, or I'll kill you. He took the thing from me lovingly. Put your arms up. Grimacing, I did as I was told, my eyes shut as tight as they could be. He started pulling the thing over my head and I smelled the putrid scent of death. It was tight on me, but Jeff managed to slip it so it covered my hips. Open your eyes, he commanded. I did slowly, not looking down. Jeff was standing before me, amazed, tears welling up. I always wanted a brother, he said quietly. And now I have one. You're beautiful. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to run. I wanted to end this parade of horror. Jeff, can I go now? 1 second. He smiled as he climbed the stairs, watching me the whole time. From the top of the stairs, he held out the gun and pointed it at me. I saw my whole life before me. My mother, who raised 2 boys without help. My brother, who I had only just realized tormented me throughout my childhood. My friends, who would never know how much I loved them. My future, which was shrinking with every second. Jeff pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. Nothing happened. He pulled out the barrel and tipped it over, showing there were no bullets inside. I'm not a monster, Ian. He then shut the door, and I was alone. Jeff never showed up back to school. I lived alone for my final semester of college. The school changed the locks, and the campus police were on the lookout for him, but I knew he would never come back. His time with me was done. Everyone asked me what happened. How did I escape? The truth is, I didn't. Not really. Sure, the cops showed up 30 minutes after Jeff locked me down there. They broke down the basement door and found me on my knees, sobbing, still in the skin suit. One of the cops threw up, the other ran to me, screaming for me to explain myself. I couldn't talk. They handcuffed me and took me to the precinct. It took 2 people to take the tight horror off my body. I couldn't stop crying. I wanted to call my mom. I wanted to go back to when I wasn't Jeff's brother. I was cleared of any wrongdoing. They collected all of Jeff's projects and condemned the house. My mother flew out to Wisconsin to take me home. Reporters flooded our return, yelling questions at me like a criminal. When, or if, they ever caught Jeff, I would have to fly back and testify at the trial. Secretly, I was hoping they would never catch him. I never wanted to see that man again. So I suppose I escaped that basement, but in a truer way, I'm still there, wearing his parents. Jeff warned me. He said it would be hell. He said I couldn't escape a real Wisconsin winter. He was right. Someone keeps making snowmen around my house in the middle of the night. It's the dead of winter, and here in rural Minnesota, the weather's been pretty much what you'd expect. I'm not too worried about that though. I've lived up here long enough to know how to properly prepare for the season. Plus, since I generally work remotely, I rarely have much reason to leave the house to brave the elements even when the weather isn't god-awful. As such, I was expecting a rather uneventful few months, bundled up on my couch with my laptop and a steady supply of hot cocoa. The only downside being that I live out here by myself, though I've never been the type to be too bothered by the solitude. However, it would seem I'm not as alone out here as I thought. For the past few weeks now, I've been waking up each morning to find that at some point in the middle of the night, someone has built a snowman somewhere on my property. Every single day, I wake up to find a new one without fail. Now, this would be weird enough on its own, but as I've mentioned, I live in rural Minnesota. The nearest town is about 20 miles from here, and my nearest neighbor is just over 5. The snow right now is 2 feet deep at a minimum. It's more than a little odd that someone would come out all this way just to build a snowman, let alone in the middle of the night. That being said, it didn't really bother me at first. From what I can tell about the traces left behind, the culprit seems to be a kid around the age of 12 or so. He always comes by way of the forest that spans the land just north of my little plot. That in itself was odd, given the fact that I don't recall anyone living up that way, but it's not like I'm the most social person anyway. It wouldn't be a surprise to me if I just didn't hear about them moving in. Besides, they are just snowmen. They aren't exactly the most threatening thing in the world. The snowmen themselves are actually pretty well made too. They're more than a few levels above the clumsily tossed together lumps of snow you'll see outside of some people's homes. Each of the 3 spheres that make up every snowman is perfectly formed, so much so that they almost look manufactured in a way. The kid didn't spare any expense on decorations either. Each snowman has been outfitted with the works. Several bits of clothing such as scarves, mittens, and hats, sturdy branches for limbs, and carefully crafted facial features made from stones and other bits likely retrieved from the forest. Admittedly, I did find the fact that they were all made to be frowning and facing towards my house a little unnerving. I guess I could have just destroyed them or something if they really started to bother me, but I was reluctant to do so. It kind of felt like kicking over a kid's sandcastle on the beach, which, unless you're some kind of sadist, is anything but a good feeling. Besides, they were harmless piles of snow, and it wasn't like they were in the way or anything. Unsettling or not, they still weren't anything worth being seriously worried about. Well, I quickly changed my mind about that last night. After nearly a month of this going on, I was ready to confront this nightly visitor. I finished all the work I had needed to get done this week, so I figured there wouldn't be any harm in pulling an all-nighter in order to try and catch the kid in the act. I still wasn't particularly bothered by what the kid was doing, but I was starting to get a bit concerned. The temperature was dropping more and more below zero each night, and I was starting to worry about the kids' safety. I had my suspicions as to the reasons behind the kids' odd behavior, and I certainly didn't want to deal with the legal troubles it would bring if they died on my property. I'd hoped that the weather would stay clear for my little stakeout, but I wasn't quite so lucky. As afternoon shifted into evening, the clear patch of weather we'd seen for the past couple of weeks came to an end as a snowstorm rushed over the mountains and bore down on us. By the time the night came around, the storm had begun in full. I could barely see more than a few yards out through my window, even with the high-powered flashlight I had on hand. I figured the kid wasn't going to be able to make his nightly trip in these conditions, but I decided to stay up just in case. It wasn't like I had anything better to do anyway. By the time 2 a.m. came rolling around, though, I'd lost all traces of this previous enthusiasm. I was most of the way through a bottle of wine, and I had long tired of shining my flashlight through my windows and only seeing figures of the nearest snowmen. I'd more or less convinced myself that it was about time to give up and turn in for the night. I felt compelled to check one last time though, if only to satisfy that little stubborn bit of my mind that didn't want to admit that I'd wasted an entire evening. God, I wish I had just gone to bed. Drawing in close to one of my windows, I slowly swept my flashlight across the yard. The storm was still going strong, but the wind had died down significantly. It had been fierce, but it seemed as if the storm would be brief too. I figured that there was a good chance it would be done by morning. The visibility had cleared up significantly, and I could now see more of the snowmen that littered my yard. In spite of the previously howling winds, not a single one of them had tipped over. After slightly melting and then refreezing once more over the past couple days and nights, the snowmen had all formed a resilient outer shell of ice. It would take more than a run-of-the-mill blizzard to make them budge. They'd probably last till spring. Somehow, they almost seemed closer to the house than before. Perhaps the decreased visibility was making me a bit claustrophobic or something like that. It's hard to say. I did find it a bit jarring though, all the same. Caught up in my thoughts, I almost didn't notice it. A flicker of movement. Something in between the snowmen that most certainly had not been there before. I did a double take, not quite sure if I'd seen what I thought I did. I swept the beam back over the spot where I thought I'd seen it, but it wasn't there anymore. If it had ever been there to begin with, that is. Perturbed, I continued to sweep my flashlight across the lawn. I had almost convinced myself that my lack of sleep was starting to get to me when I heard something. A rustling just to the left of my window. The beam of my flashlight quickly flitted over to where I thought the sound had come from, but I was only able to just barely catch sight of it before it disappeared around the corner of my house. This time though, I was certain of what I had seen. A flicker of movement, a human figure, and the smallish bare foot of a child just before it disappeared out of sight. I cursed under my breath, pulling on a coat and a pair of boots. Not only was this kid out in this mess, but he was barefoot, if not worse. Where in the heck were this kid's parents, and why in the heck weren't they keeping a better eye on him? I wasn't eager to throw myself out into a blizzard, but I knew I had to. I wasn't even sure if this kid knew where the heck he was, and I sure as hell wasn't gonna let this kid die out there on my lawn. Shivering, I went out my back door, ducking around to the side of the house I thought the kid was on. I'd hoped he'd be close to the house still, so I wouldn't have to venture too far into the blizzard, but I wasn't so lucky. I found his tracks. They were quickly being covered up by the falling snow, but were clear enough to tell that he'd wandered off further into the blizzard. Letting off more than a few expletives, I hurried off after the kid before I completely lost track of him. I followed the tracks further out towards the edge of my property. I debated calling out for the kid, but decided not to, worried that I might spook him. I strained my eyes and ears to catch some sort of trace of him, but it wasn't easy in the howling blizzard. The snow muffled everything, the wind drowned everything out, and my flashlight beam could only reach so far. I'd walked for a couple minutes, and all I had seen were the snowmen. The tracks were fading fast, and I was worried I might lose the trail entirely. It was then that I heard it, a sort of rustling and scraping, not unlike a small animal trying to dig itself a burrow. It was the kid. It had to be. I did my best to quiet my steps as I crept closer. We were near the woods at the edge of my property now. I neared the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from behind a few bushes. Quietly making my way around, I swept my light across the edge of the dark forest, hoping that the kid wouldn't run away at the sight of me. You see, I only see it now in retrospect that my entire perception of what had been going on was based on assumptions. I'd come across something unusual and unexplained in my otherwise normal life, and I had done automatically my best to rationalize it. Sure, I may have felt uneasy about what was going on, but I never felt like I was in any sort of danger. Though, when my flashlight beam settled on that thing hunched over in the snow, I quickly realized that I had been taking things far too lightly. The first thing I realized is that it wasn't just barefoot, it was completely naked. From head to toe, there wasn't a thread to be seen anywhere. That was the least of my concerns, though, as I realized under further examination that what I was looking at may not even be human. Its skin was white with tinges of blue, barely indistinguishable from the snow around it. Its icy hide was pulled taut over its bony frame, which seemed to almost poke through in spots. Its spine stood out in particular, its bony ridges traveling down its hunched back and leading one's eyes down to its strange, short and fleshy tail. It had the overall shape and size of a human child, but it was anything but. It was much more like a naked mole rat or some kind of hairless cat. It was bent over, its gnarled root-like hands clawing the surrounding snow together and forming it into a large ball. Its movements were frantic and erratic, like a rodent or a cockroach scurrying across the floor. It was so outside the realm of anything I was expecting, my mind couldn't figure out how to react. That quickly changed though. The flashlight hadn't alerted the creature for whatever reason, but I wasn't able to mask my shocked gasp of breath at the sight of it. It froze and then quickly whipped around to face me. Its face, it wasn't right. The proportions were all off. The eyes too small, the mouth far too big. The nose was practically non-existent. Its beady black eyes were fixed on my own, and its wide mouth, full of teeth like shards of ice, was fixed in a snarl. My mind caught up with itself, and I felt a fearful chill rush through me. It was so much colder than the blizzard around us. It let out a screech not unlike nails in a chalkboard. I screamed right back, falling backwards as I desperately backpedaled away from it. My flashlight flickered like crazy before going out completely. A few frantic smacks got it working again, and I focused it once more on where the creature had been, but it was nowhere to be seen. I had no idea where it went, but I was certainly not sticking around to find out. I rushed back through the snowmen to my house, and I swear they were all looking at me. Their frowns were deeper, angrier even. I didn't waste any time examining them in any great detail, though. Quickly making my way inside the house, I locked all the doors and closed all the curtains and blinds before huddling up on the couch and trying to shiver the chill of fear away. I'd had my fill of beady black eyes for the evening, on snowmen or otherwise. The night was uneventful after that, thankfully. I fell asleep at some point, my fatigue overcoming my fading panic. I've been trying to convince myself that last night was all just a bad dream or something like that. I haven't been quite able to manage that. I don't really know what to do about any of this. I mean, I guess I could call the cops, but even if they believed me, it's not like they could make it out here. The roads are impassable this far out. I'm not even really sure if I'm in any sort of danger or anything really. The creature could have been as scared of me as I was of it. Who knows? All of this is so far outside my realm of experience. I don't feel confident enough to even guess. I'm sure as hell not leaving the house anytime soon though. You see, when I woke up this morning, all the snowmen had disappeared without a trace. The snow around where they stood is completely undisturbed. It doesn't look like they were knocked over, carried away, or anything like that. I don't know what's been going on, but I'm not setting a single foot outside until I know for sure they've gone. An ultra-wealthy neighborhood hired me to look after their empty houses during the winter. I think I'm supposed to ignore the screams. I wove my snowmobile back and forth as the road curved along the mountainside. The previous night's storm had brought down another 3 or 4 feet of snow on top of the 7 feet that had already fallen. I was thankful for my snowmobile. Without it, there was no way I'd be able to get it around each house. I've been working as the sole winter caretaker for the Pinecrest gated community for almost 3 weeks. Pinecrest is a collection of a dozen or so multi-million-dollar mansions situated high in the mountains of Colorado. It overlooks an absolutely stunning and absolutely private mountain view. I brought my snowmobile to a stop in front of a mansion and switched off the engine, looking out over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains that dominated the horizon. The sudden absence of the snowmobile's engine and the quiet of fresh fallen snow brought a silence so complete that it was almost unnerving. I blew warm air into my gloves to fight off the chill that was seeping into them. During the summer months, I doubt there's a more beautiful view in the entire world. One of the selling points of Pinecrest is how remote the neighborhood is. A single winding road connects Pinecrest with the rest of the world, a road that's rendered completely impassable by car during 4 months of the year. The millionaires who own the homes treat them like summer houses, only living there a few months each year. During the 4 winter months, the neighborhood is all but abandoned. That's why they hired me. I'm supposed to make sure the houses are staying warm alarm, check for vandalism or robbers, and look after things in general. Living out in the mountains for the absurd salary they were paying was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. I turned my engine over and carved along the road. I'd already checked up on the houses higher up the mountainside. Once I was done with the rest, I could get back to my little cottage and spend the rest of the night reading or surfing the internet. I pulled to a stop in front of the Mayberry's mansion. I pulled out an infrared camera to check that the house was staying warm. Once that was confirmed, I looked it over to make sure no windows were broken. Almost no one knew this place existed, and those that did had so much money that I had a hard time imagining them stealing from anyone except their customers. I was about to turn the engine over when I paused. If it wasn't for the snow muffling all the other noises, there would be no way I would have heard it. A voice called out for help from the Mayberry house. I slung my leg off the snowmobile and tramped down the hill towards the house, listening hard. Is someone out there? Please help. It sounded like a young girl. I knew for a fact that no one had gone into or left the Mayberry house for the better part of a month. I hadn't seen a single vehicle, a single light, a single person the entire time I'd been up here. Yeah, I shouted. Who is that? I waited, but there was no response. I cursed under my breath and rounded the house towards the front door. I'd been given a set of keys, but had been told to only enter the houses in the case of an emergency. I figured this qualified. I pushed the key into the slot and opened the 12-foot tall wooden front door. My jaw dropped as I saw the inside of their house. It reminded me of a hunting lodge. The living room had a 20-foot tall ceiling with walls covered in animal pelts and heads. The head of an elephant hung over the fireplace, ringed by moose, hippos, and a dozen other animals. I looked down to see that I was standing on what was clearly a lion pelt serving as a rug to the entryway. Hello? I called out. Anyone need help in here? Down here, a girl called out, her voice desperate. Please help me. I pulled out a flashlight and made my way to the basement door. A strange symbol was carved into the wood. It looked like several intertwined circles. I pulled open the door and walked down into the darkness. The basement didn't have any pelts or taxidermied animals. No, all the animals in the basement were still alive. I walked past cage after cage, sweeping my flashlight into them one by one. Most were animals that I could name. A deer, a dog, one containing several Komodo dragons. But there were some cages that held animals I didn't recognize, like one glass tank held a serpent-like fish that seemed to be staring at me with an intelligence that made me shiver. Hello? I called out again, my voice weak. Down here, at the end of the hall, the girl called out again, her voice shrill. I sped past a section with several cages containing disturbingly humanoid figures. At the end of the hall, I found a cage unlike the others. While the other cages were either glass or crisscrossed with metal bars, this one was completely enclosed by metal sheets. Please, I'm so thirsty, she said. A large warning was printed on the side of the cage that read, only trigger release after confirmation of death. I held my hand over the button, then paused. Instead, I reached for a small metallic slide that appeared to serve as a peephole to the inside of the cage. I pulled it back and peered through along with my flashlight. A mass of hairy orange flesh filled the cage. 3 of his eyes turned to stare at me, and a distended mouth gave me a frustrated noise. Well, it was worth a shot, the thing said. Its voice started high, like the girl I'd been hearing, but slowly deepened into a guttural, slimy croak. I staggered back from the cage, fighting back vomit as the smell washed over me. What the hell? I asked. It just gave me a guttural chuckle. You're not from Pinecrest, are you, boy? I continued to step back, then ran down the hallway towards the front door. The creature called after me, its voice bubbling with laughter. Every family in Pinecrest finds a way to show off to the others, and trust me, I'm not the worst. I kept running and eventually made it to the front of the house. I slammed the front door, locked it with my key, then hopped onto my snowmobile. I spent the next several hours trying to make sense of what I had seen, especially with what that thing had said about Pinecrest residents trying to impress each other. I can't stay here without knowing what's inside the other houses. If I decide to enter another, I'll update you all here.